Kurt Cobain was sitting in a conference room at Geffen Records, headquarters in Los Angeles, when they played him the news. In Utero was finished. The album that was supposed to be Nirvana's follow-up to the 20 million selling Nevermind was complete, mixed, and ready for manufacturing. And Geffen Records was refusing to release it. Eddie Rosenblatt, the president of Geffen, sat across the table with his arms folded. "Kurt, we can't put this out. It's not radio-friendly. It sounds deliberately uncommercial. We need you to go back into the studio and remix it, maybe re-record some of the songs." Kurt looked at the executives sitting around that conference table, and then he did something that would change the music industry forever. He said 2 words: "Fuck you." To understand what happened in that conference room in early 1993, you need to understand the impossible position Nirvana was in. Nevermind had been released in September 1991 and had become the most unlikely blockbuster in music history. A punk band from Seattle with a self-destructive frontman had somehow created an album that spoke to millions of alienated teenagers around the world. It knocked Michael Jackson off the top of the charts. It made grunge music mainstream. It turned Kurt Cobain into a reluctant spokesman for Generation X. And it made Geffen Records an enormous amount of money. By early 1993, the pressure on Nirvana to deliver another massive hit was crushing. Geffen had invested millions in the band. They'd built their entire release schedule around the new Nirvana album. Radio stations were waiting. MTV was waiting. Retailers were waiting. The entire music industry apparatus was geared up for Nirvana to deliver Nevermind Part Two, except Kurt. Cobain had absolutely no intention of giving them that. He'd spent the past year and a half being uncomfortable with fame, angry at being misunderstood, and resentful of the corporate machinery that had turned his pain into profit. He wanted to make an album that would deliberately alienate the casual fans who had jumped on the Nirvana bandwagon. He wanted to make something raw, abrasive, and uncompromisingly punk rock. So in February 1993, Nirvana went into Pachyderm Studio in Minnesota with producer Steve Albini to record In Utero. Albini was the opposite of a mainstream producer. He was known for his raw, unpolished sound. He refused to use conventional production tricks. He recorded bands the way they actually sounded, with all their imperfections and rough edges intact. Kurt specifically chose Albini because he knew it would result in an album that sounded nothing like Nevermind. And that's exactly what he got. The recording sessions were intense and fast. Albini worked quickly, capturing performances in just a few takes. Kurt's vocals were raw and unfiltered, sometimes barely more than screams. The guitars were harsh and distorted. The lyrics were darker and more confrontational than anything on Nevermind. Songs like Rape Me were deliberately provocative. Heart-Shaped Box was beautiful but disturbing. All Apologies was vulnerable in a way that made people uncomfortable. This wasn't an album designed to sell 20 million copies. This was an album designed to say exactly what Kurt wanted to say. Commercial appeal be damned. When the band finished recording and mixing In Utero in March 1993, they were thrilled with the result. Dave Grohl thought it was the best thing they'd ever done. Chris Novoselic loved how authentic it sounded. Kurt felt like he'd finally made an album that represented who Nirvana really was, not who MTV and mainstream radio wanted them to be. They delivered the master tapes to Geffen Records with confidence that they'd fulfilled their artistic vision, and then they waited for the label's response. The response came in the form of an emergency meeting at Geffen's Los Angeles headquarters. Kurt, Dave, and Chris were flown down from Seattle and ushered into a conference room. Eddie Rosenblatt was there, along with several other senior executives. The atmosphere was tense from the moment they walked in. "We listened to the album," Rosenblatt began, his voice carefully controlled. "Multiple times. We brought in radio consultants. We played it for retailers, and frankly, we have serious concerns. Kurt already knew where this was going. He'd been expecting it. What kind of concerns? Rosenblatt gestured to another executive who pulled out a folder full of notes. The overall sound quality is muddy. It's not as clean and polished as Nevermind. The vocals are often buried in the mix. The songs don't have obvious singles. Rape Me is completely unplayable on radio. Even the title, In Utero, is going to make major retailers uncomfortable. This album, as it currently exists, is not commercially viable. Dave started to respond, but Kurt put his hand on his arm. So what are you saying? Kurt asked, his voice dangerously calm. Rosenblatt leaned forward. We're saying we need you to go back into the studio, work with a different producer. Someone like Andy Wallace, who mixed Nevermind. Polish the sound. Maybe write 1 or 2 more radio-friendly songs. Make some adjustments so we can actually get this music to your fans. Kurt stared at him for a long moment. You mean make it more commercial? Rosenblatt didn't flinch. We mean make it releasable. The room went silent. Everyone was watching Kurt, waiting to see how he would react. The executives knew they were walking a tightrope. They needed Nirvana to cooperate, but they also had millions of dollars and the expectations of the entire music industry riding on this album. Kurt knew he was at a crossroads. He could compromise, let them remix the album, add some polish, play the game. It would be easier. It would keep everyone happy. Or he could stand his ground and risk everything. No, Kurt said simply. Rosenblatt blinked. No. Kurt's voice was getting louder. No, we're not remixing it. We're not re-recording anything. We're not writing more commercial songs. This is the album. Take it or leave it. Another executive jumped in, trying a different approach. Kurt, be reasonable. We're not asking you to compromise your artistic vision. We're just asking you to make the album accessible to the millions of fans who love Nirvana. Don't you want your music to reach as many people as possible? Kurt laughed, but there was no humor in it. You know what's funny? When we were an underground band playing to 50 people in Seattle, nobody at this label gave a shit about our artistic vision, but we sold 20 million copies of Nevermind. And suddenly you all care very deeply about making sure our music reaches people. You don't care about the music. You care about the money. Rosenblatt's face was getting red. That's not fair, Kurt. We've supported this band from the beginning. We've given you creative freedom. We've invested millions in promoting your music. All we're asking is that you meet us halfway. Kurt stood up from his chair. You supported us when we accidentally made you rich. Now you want us to do it again on command. That's not how art works. That's not how Nirvana works. Dave and Chris exchanged glances. They could see this was heading toward a complete breakdown. Another executive tried to mediate. Let's all take a breath here. Kurt, what if we just remix a couple of songs? Not re-record. Just remix. Make them a little clearer. That's not compromising your vision. That's just making sure people can actually hear what you created. Kurt shook his head. You don't get it. The way it sounds is part of what it is. Steve Albini recorded it the way we wanted it. Recorded, raw, real, not polished and processed, like every other corporate rock album. If you don't like it, if you think it's not commercially viable, then don't release it. We'll take it somewhere else. The room erupted. Multiple executives started talking at once. You're under contract. You can't. Just take it to another label. Be realistic. Kurt. Rosenblatt held up his hand for silence. When the room quieted down, he looked directly at Kurt. You're right. You're under contract. Geffen owns the rights to this album. If we don't release it, nobody releases it. So let me be very clear about where we stand. As it currently exists, we will not release In Utero. It needs to be remixed, at minimum. If you refuse to cooperate, this album will sit on a shelf and your fans will never hear it. Is that what you want? It was a power play, and everyone in the room knew it. Geffen was betting that Kurt would back down, rather than let his music go unreleased. They were betting that his desire to share his art with the world would override his stubbornness. They were betting wrong. Kurt Cobain looked at Eddie Rosenblatt and said, "If you won't release the album as it is, then fuck you. I'll buy the masters back from you. I'll take out a loan if I have to, and I'll release it myself on an independent label. But I'm not letting you turn it into another piece of corporate product." The executives looked at each other in disbelief. Artists didn't talk to record label presidents this way. Not artists who wanted to have careers, but Kurt wasn't bluffing. He'd rather see his career implode than compromise on something this important. Dave spoke up, trying to find some middle ground. "Look, maybe there's a way to work this out. What if we brought in someone we all trust to give an objective opinion? Someone who understands both the artistic side and the commercial reality?" Chris nodded. "Yeah, like a mediator." But Kurt was done negotiating. "There's nothing to mediate. Either they release the album we made, or they don't release it at all. Those are the only two options." He turned and walked toward the door. "I'm going back to Seattle. When you decide to support your artists, instead of trying to control them, give me a call." And he left, just walked out of the meeting, leaving Dave and Chris to deal with the stunned executives. Dave apologized and followed Kurt out. Chris shrugged at the executives and said, "He's right, you know. The album's great the way it is." Then he left, too. In the hallway, Dave caught up with Kurt. "Man, you just told Geffen Records to go fuck themselves. Do you understand how bad this could get?" Kurt lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. "I understand perfectly. They think they own us because we made them money. They think we'll do whatever they want because we're under contract. But they're wrong. I didn't get into music to be controlled by people in suits who don't give a shit about art." Dave sighed. "So what happens now?" Kurt took a drag on his cigarette. "Now we wait and see if they have the balls to not release an album by the biggest band in the world. My bet is they'll fold." Kurt was right, but it didn't happen quickly. For the next several weeks, there was a standoff. Geffen refused to schedule a release date for In Utero. Kurt refused to make any changes to the album. The music press started reporting on the conflict, with headlines like Nirvana's new album in limbo and Kurt Cobain versus Geffen Records, battle over artistic control. Some journalists sided with Kurt, praising him for standing up to corporate pressure. Others criticized him for being difficult and potentially sabotaging his own career. Behind the scenes, Geffen was in crisis mode. They had retailers asking when the new Nirvana album would be available. They had radio stations waiting for singles to play. They had international distributors with pre-orders in the millions. And they had an artist who refused to cooperate. Eddie Rosenblatt called meeting after meeting with his team, trying to figure out how to resolve the situation. Some executives argued they should hold firm and force Kurt to compromise. Others worried that if word got out that Geffen was suppressing a Nirvana album, it would be a public relations disaster. Meanwhile, Kurt was back in Seattle, doing interviews where he openly discussed the conflict. "They want me to make Nevermind Part Two," he told a magazine. "They want me to sand off all the rough edges and make something safe and commercial. But that's not who we are. That's not what Nirvana is about. We made the album we wanted to make. If Geffen doesn't want to release it, that tells you everything you need to know about how record labels view artists. We're just products to them. Revenue streams. They don't care about the music." The interview was widely circulated, and public opinion started to shift heavily in Kurt's favor. Other artists began speaking out in support of Kurt. Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam, who had his own complicated relationship with fame and the music industry, publicly praised Kurt for standing his ground. Independent labels reached out, offering to release In Utero if Kurt could get out of his Geffen contract. Music critics wrote, think, pieces about artistic integrity versus commercial pressure. The narrative was becoming clear. Kurt Cobain The reluctant voice of a generation was fighting against a greedy record label that wanted to control his art, and Geffen Records was losing the PR battle badly. Finally, after 6 weeks of standoff, Geffen blinked. Eddie Rosenblatt called a meeting with Kurt. But this time it was different. This time, Rosenblatt came to Seattle instead of demanding Kurt come to Los Angeles. They met at a restaurant near Kurt's house. Rosenblatt sat down across from Kurt and said, "We're going to release In Utero as recorded." Kurt didn't show any reaction. "Completely as recorded? No remixing?" Rosenblatt nodded. "We'll need to remix Heart-Shaped Box and All Apologies for single release, just so radio can actually play them. But the album versions stay exactly as Steve Albini mixed them. Deal?" Kurt thought about it. Remixing 2 songs specifically for radio release wasn't the same as changing the album. The artistic statement would remain intact. "Who does the remix?" Kurt asked. "Scott Litt. He's worked with REM. He's respected. He won't mess with the songs, just make them clearer for radio." Kurt nodded slowly. "Okay, but the album versions don't change at all. And I get final approval on the radio mixes." Rosenblatt extended his hand. "Deal." They shook hands, and just like that, the war was over. Kurt Cobain had won. In Utero was released on September 21st, 1993, despite Geffen's fears, despite the lack of obvious singles, despite the raw and uncommercial sound. It debuted at #1 on the Billboard charts. It sold over 180,000 copies in its first week. Critics praised it as a more mature and honest album than Nevermind. Fans appreciated that Nirvana hadn't sold out, hadn't tried to recapture their previous success with a formula. The album was successful precisely because it was uncompromising, because it was real, because Kurt Cobain had refused to let a record label tell him what his art should sound like. But the story didn't end there. What happened with In Utero changed something fundamental in how record labels dealt with successful artists. Before that, the standard operating procedure was simple. When an artist made you a lot of money, you pressured them to repeat that success by any means necessary. You remixed their albums without their input. You forced them to write more commercial songs. You controlled the creative process because you held the financial power. Kurt Cobain proved that didn't have to be the case. After the In Utero battle became public, other artists started pushing back against label control. Pearl Jam famously went to war with Ticketmaster over concert pricing and control. Radiohead would later leave their label entirely to release albums independently. Artists began including more protective language in their contracts, ensuring they maintained creative control. The balance of power between artists and labels started to shift, slowly but noticeably. And it started with Kurt Cobain saying, "Fuck you," to one of the most powerful record labels in the world. Years later, music industry executives would look back at the In Utero conflict as a turning point. Kurt changed the game. One former Geffen executive admitted in an interview, "Before him, artists generally did what they were told, or they got dropped. After him, labels had to be more careful, because if word got out that you were suppressing or controlling a major artist's work, the PR damage was too severe." Kurt proved that artists could win these battles if they were willing to fight. Steve Albini, the producer of In Utero, spoke about the conflict in later interviews. What Kurt did was incredibly brave. He had everything to lose. Geffen could have shelved that album forever. They could have sued him. They could have made his life hell. But he stood his ground because he believed in the music. And he was right to believe in it. That album is Nirvana at their most honest. It's what they really sounded like, without corporate polish. That's why it mattered. That's why it still matters. Dave Grohl reflected on the battle years after Kurt's death. "That whole situation with Geffen showed me who Kurt really was. He wasn't afraid of anything when it came to his music. He would have walked away from millions of dollars rather than compromise. Most people don't understand how rare that is. Most artists, when a label tells them to make changes, they make the changes because they're scared. Scared of losing their deal, scared of not being successful, scared of being dropped. Kurt wasn't scared of any of that. He was only scared of betraying his own vision. The In Utero battle also revealed something about the relationship between commercial success and artistic integrity. Geffen had assumed that Nirvana's success with Nevermind came from its relative polish and accessibility. They thought if they made In Utero more like Nevermind, it would be equally successful. But they misunderstood what made Nirvana connect with audiences. It wasn't the polish. It was the authenticity. It was the sense that this band was real, that Kurt Cobain was genuinely expressing something, not performing for commercial gain. When In Utero succeeded, despite being raw and uncommercial, it proved that audiences were smarter and more sophisticated than record labels gave them credit for. The album's success also validated Kurt's instincts about his audience. He'd been convinced that the true Nirvana fans would appreciate In Utero more than the casual listeners who had jumped on the Nevermind bandwagon. He was right. The album separated the devoted fans from the fair-weather ones, and there were more than enough devoted fans to make it a massive success. Kurt had trusted his audience to come with him to a darker, more challenging place, and they did. But the victory came at a cost. The stress of the battle with Geffen, combined with Kurt's already fragile mental health and ongoing struggles with addiction, took a toll. The months of fighting with executives, of defending his artistic vision, of dealing with the pressure and expectations, wore him down. In interviews following the album's release, Kurt often looked exhausted. The triumph of getting In Utero released as he'd intended was real, but it hadn't solved his deeper problems. It hadn't made him comfortable with fame. It hadn't resolved his internal conflicts about success and commercialism. In one of his last interviews before his death in April 1994, Kurt talked about the Geffen battle. "I'm glad we fought for In Utero. I'm glad we didn't compromise. But the fact that we had to fight at all, the fact that a record label felt they had the right to tell us how our music should sound, that's the problem with this whole industry. They see artists as investments, not as people with something to say. And that's never going to change, no matter how many battles we win. The irony is that In Utero has aged better than Nevermind in many ways. While Nevermind remains iconic, In Utero is often cited by critics and musicians as Nirvana's most important work. Its raw sound and unflinching lyrics capture something essential about Kurt Cobain and about that moment in music history. It's the album Kurt wanted to make, unfiltered by corporate concerns or commercial calculations, and that authenticity is why it endures. That's the real story of how Geffen Records tried to control Kurt Cobain and failed. No compromise, no backing down. Just one artist refusing to let business considerations override artistic truth. Kurt knew that if he gave in on In Utero, he'd be giving in forever. Every future album would be a negotiation, a battle, a compromise. By standing his ground on that one album, he established that Nirvana's music would always be on Nirvana's terms, even if it meant career suicide, even if it meant financial ruin, even if it meant war with one of the most powerful labels in music. Geffen Records wanted Kurt Cobain to make them another 20 million selling album. Instead, he made them an album that mattered, an album that was honest, an album that proved you could achieve commercial success without compromising your artistic soul. And in doing so, he changed not just Nirvana's trajectory, but the entire relationship between artists and the music industry. That's what happened when Geffen Records tried to control Kurt Cobain. That's the night he said, "Fuck you," and meant it. That's how one artist's refusal to compromise shook an entire industry to its core.